the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 91.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and we have on, once again, Tom Kirkman. He always has great and insightful things to say. And today we talk about mainly the petrodollar and what is coming and how it's being impacted by nations and what's going on around the world. If you look at Venezuela, the Middle East, and all these interests and how they, on some level they align and other points they diverge. And the petrodollar is kind of caught up in that mix right now. And so Tom comes on to help break that down for us. And so without further ado, here is my interview with Tom Kirkman. Well, Tom, it's always a pleasure to get you on the show and to kind of just hear your perspective on things. How's it going today?
Great. How's it going over there?
It's going well. It's going well. A lot's happened since we last talked. Oil is finally over $50 a barrel. I haven't checked it this afternoon or this morning where you're at, but it was over 50. WTI has been over 50 for a little bit now, and people were excited. And obviously Brent, I think it was 58 I saw this morning, or 56, I can't remember. So people were excited. What's kind of your take on the global picture of oil right now?
I'm actually happy oil is going up, but I hope it doesn't go up too much. I've said for about 2 years now, on and off, if oil would stick to $50 and stay at $50 without roller coastering, I'd actually be quite happy. $50 seems to be the magic number. I think I mentioned this the last time. Gets too much higher than that, you start the mad roller coaster ride, especially when U.S. shale kicks in. Too low, it's not sustainable. So $60 is probably the upper range of what we can do. If it goes much over 60, then it's going to become a cyclical nightmare again.
Yeah, in my view. I saw Harold Hamm the other day talking, and he said a couple interesting things. One, he does think it's going to get to 60, but he thinks that one of the reasons was he thinks that the EIA data that's coming out is wrong. And I've heard some people kind of allude to that from time to time, that maybe it's not 100%. Obviously, it's not 100% right, but it may be a little bit more wrong than we're kind of led to believe. Coming from your side of the world, the EIA data, how do you look at that? Do you look at that and go, yeah, that's kind of over here, we use that as the gospel, or is it just kind of a small part of the bigger picture?
I am not a firm believer of government statistics. So there's some truth to it, but you've got to take a grain of salt to it. So when Oil Pro is still around, we used to discuss those numbers, and some people were very adamant that these numbers are just fudged. Some people were very adamant that, no, these are accurate. The truth is somewhere in between. So Harold Hamm is self-serving, so obviously he's going to say whatever's in the interest of his companies and himself. If oil goes up to $60 and stays at $60, I'll actually be happy, but I don't think it'll stay at 60. I think it'll retreat fairly shortly.
Yeah, on Hamm, I think it's interesting. He's a interesting character. Obviously, I've talked about it on the show before. The book, The Frackers, it kind of highlights him and what happens there. But one of the things that I think it's maybe some of the media covers is, but when the oil crash started happening in 2014, he sold all of his hedges out. I think it was 100% of them he sold, and he lost, I don't remember how many hundreds of millions of dollars for his company, because he thought the oil market was going to bottom at 60, which he was off. Just slightly there. So I always kind of, when I hear him talk now, I remember that, and I go, yeah, I'm not too sure that you're the best analyst either. Not that I am or anyone is, but he kind of stuck his foot in his mouth a few times, and so obviously he knows a lot about the oil market. So I don't want to sound like I'm being too disparaging here, but I have noticed, like you say, he can be a little bit self-serving at times.
Yes, I don't really trust him. I'm not saying he's not a nice guy or whatever. It's just I don't trust the way he does business. And I mentioned before that the whole U.S. shale oil is, to me, a hamster wheel. It's all revolves around debt, and once the credit is cut off, then things are going to be in trouble. One of the things that I see coming up, and here's a totally left-hand turn here, is I see the petrodollar is under attack internationally. A lot of things are going on, and I think this is going to affect oil prices and LNG prices. So let me clarify a little bit what I'm saying. There's been talk for decades of the petrodollar being replaced because basically oil is mostly priced in U.S. dollars around the world, but that's changing. Qatar right now, which is the world's largest exporter of LNG, has been doing business with Iran using Chinese yuan. Venezuela's not accepting U.S. dollars anymore for payment. China has provided, I think, $10 billion credit to Iran in both yuan and euros in order to bypass U.S. dollar sanctions. Russia this year plans to stop using U.S. dollars at its ports. And China is getting ready to launch a crude oil futures contract, and that's going to be priced in yuan and 100% fully convertible to gold. Again, the way I view it is the petrodollar has been the basis of pricing for oil for decades, and just like OPEC used to be the 800-pound gorilla, and now their relevance is reduced. The petrodollar is not going to go away, but its relevance is going to be reduced as China, Russia, Venezuela, Qatar, Iran, all these countries attempt to sell and trade oil and LNG in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. So how's that for a left field?
That is left turn. I want to just touch on a few things on Ham real quick before we get to the petrodollar, just to clarify. You may have not heard that he did announce, I think the last quarter, that they are going to cash at Continental Resources. So that will be interesting to see how well that holds out. And one point of contention that one point to note rather I always like to say is that we can be critical of him and praise his success at the same time. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm completely bashing the man when he's not here to defend himself. But on to the
I understand.
No. I know. I know. Me and you talk off the line a lot, and so people may not know that when we're talking, we're not just being overly critical of him. But anyways, on to the petrodollar. So one of the things is that you sit back and you kind of look at how these currencies are interacting here. You mentioned Japan there. A lot of our U.S. listeners they should know now if they've been listening to the show for a long time. We've had on Paul Sullivan to talk about this, but Japan's dependency on the Middle East makes it almost kind of at odds with the U.S. sometimes. So it's interesting to see that you're saying that you think that the petrodollar is under attack. How will Japan play into that in the long term?
Here, Qatar will be probably doing the leading edge as far as liquefied natural gas. So Japan is still a huge buyer of LNG from Qatar and other countries. So if Qatar makes it a point, especially the political, this is what I love about oil and gas. There's so much geopolitical stuff going on besides just oil, all the political conflicts and stuff. So the current spat in the Middle East between Qatar and the Saudi-led coalition is getting a lot of people upset. So if Qatar decides they're going to screw the U.S. dollar and do as much business as possible in both the Chinese yuan and euros to bypass the U.S. dollar and sell their LNG in yuan and euros rather than USD, that is going to have an effect. They're just one of it's mostly the BRICS countries, but not just BRICS. So as I said, Qatar, Venezuela, China, Russia, these countries are getting together and finding ways to basically bypass the U.S. dollar for trading oil, gas, and LNG. So the petrodollar is not going to go away, not anytime soon anyway. But just like the OPEC power has been reduced from its heyday in the 1970s, now they're down to not so much influence anymore, and you've got the startups of U.S. shale, which has really thrown a brick into the OPEC dominance. The same way the U.S. petrodollar is going to lose some of its dominance very shortly, within the next year or so, from what I can see, with all these countries that are trying to find ways of trading oil and gas without using U.S. dollars.
Well, what's interesting about that is I've read some people talk about why we buy oil with the dollar, but with the foreign stock exchange, it's open 24/7, 5 days a week, 5.5 days a week. Actually, it would seem that now is that kind of one of those old policies I was talking earlier today on a podcast about. Some energy policies are just kind of old policies that they were good at a time, but now we've kind of outgrown them. With the Forex market, do we actually need to buy all the oil in dollars? In your opinion? No.
I mean, this was all set up decades ago between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Basically, right. The U.S. would provide military aid in exchange for Saudi Arabia doing, selling its oil only in U.S. dollars. So that day is basically come and gone. Now, if there's going to be friction between Saudi Arabia and the U.S., I don't want to get too much into politics here,
sure.
But if there's going to be friction, that's just going to accelerate the move away from using the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency for oil.
Yeah.
So yes, there is a concerted. I mean, China has already given 10 billion in credit to Iran in both in yuan and euros. It's already happened, and that's specifically to bypass U.S. sanctions against Iran. So China's playing the game, and China has their whole money diplomacy where they want to get trade routes around the world, and they're going to be using it in yuan, which will be ideally, in their view, it will be 100% convertible to gold. So again, that is a huge threat to the U.S. petrodollar.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that now, if you're not familiar with the forex market, I would encourage you to go look it up. But as the average consumer, the forex market should, on some level, kind of protect you from swings in currencies because you can go and trade other currencies and things like that. So it just seems like we're at, and I'm sure all points of history you could probably go back and people felt this way. But to me, it feels like, at least in the oil and gas and energy in general, we're at a point in history where I think the next 10 to 20 years, we're just going to see so many changes to how we think about stuff, how we do stuff, that some of these problems we're looking at today, they could be solved quite easily, and they could be solved if we just step back and look at the tools that are there for us. If we do we need to buy every barrel of oil with the U.S. greenback? Well, I mean, obviously, some people would be in favor of that. As you know, I'm a big free markets guy. I want the market to work itself out the best way it can possible. And it seems like we're getting to a point now with everyone coming online that the market really should be able to work itself out, and we should be able to have countries and people that can compete on a global scale.
Actually, diversity is good. I'm not sure how to respond to what you just said. That was quite a bit. Actually, what I'm looking at what got me interested in looking at closely at the petrodollar dominance right now is what I found interesting is not long ago, Venezuela stated they are going to stop accepting U.S. dollars for oil. Very shortly, within days after that, the U.S. president came out and said they've got to take action against Venezuela, and I think those two are related. Again, it's a threat to the dominance of the U.S. dollar in oil. There were rumors years ago, a decade ago, that Gaddafi was overthrown because he was trying to use gold as a standard to get away from using U.S. dollars for his oil and gas. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. Anyway, what I see is more diversity coming up, and the petrodollar losing some of its dominance, but still being the dominant position in oil and gas trading, similar to OPEC losing its dominance of what they were in the heyday. So as the petrodollar comes under more concerted attack by different countries with their own vested interests, I think there'll be more diversity. And to me, that means the price of oil is going to go crazy. I'm not looking forward to another roller coaster ride, but with the price of oil going up right now, if it stays at 60, I'll be happy, but I don't think it will. It's going to go back down again.
Yeah, I don't think it will either. Especially if it holds to 60 as we go into October, November, December, that will be a big green light for U.S. shale producers as we roll into 2018. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that would be good for the long term prices we've talked about before. But as you mentioned with Venezuela, there, if they get off the petrodollar and they're trading with nations that don't want to use that currency anymore, it could be a kind of one of those landmark moments where we look back 10 years from now, and Venezuela was the one to kind of buck the system, and who will align with them. And so I haven't really followed it from that perspective. I just kind of been following it from the sanctions perspective and how would that affect, because there's some Canadian deals that might come into play here in the U.S. if these sanctions are long term. So as you mentioned, when you get to the global geopolitics of this stuff, there's so many moving parts. It's just fascinating.
Well, the biggest investors in Venezuelan oil right now are Russia and China, and both of them are trying to move away from the U.S. dollar. So as I said, there's a concerted effort. And what I found interesting is within days after Venezuela announced they're not going to trade oil, they're not going to accept U.S. dollars anymore for oil, that's when Trump came out and said action has to be taken against Venezuela. And again, that I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah. It's interesting that I can see Russia obviously taking that stand, but it would seem that that move would kind of work against China's interest in the U.S. to weaken the dollar. Am I missing something?
No, but see, China has its long-term plan. And one of the differences between China and the U.S. is that Western countries in general work on quarters and annual, returns to shareholders. China and some of the other countries work on a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. They have longer-term goals. So China is trying to set up trade around the world that is going to be beneficial to China. And they're trying to use yuan as the reserve currency for this trade with, the EU and other countries around the world. So the decline of the U.S. petrodollar will not necessarily affect China negatively, in my view. China would probably be fairly happy about it. There would be some hiccups about it, but it would be bad news for the U.S., but overall, I think it would be good to get away from one dominant reserve currency and add a little bit more diversity to the basket. I think it would be good.
Okay, one final question for you, and we'll let you get out of here. You mentioned gold a few times. Is gold a viable option to buy and sell oil? Some people have said that just the pure volume of oil that's traded, gold really wouldn't work well. What's your take on that?
It's not really. You can't really buy and sell oil using gold, but using gold to back a currency. For example, Russia and China are both buying up gold at mad amounts of rate to basically shore up their currencies, the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan, backed by gold. The U.S. doesn't do that. The U.S. the U.S. dollar used to be backed by gold, but it's not anymore.
And that
the U.S. doesn't have.
That is a discussion that we could have another day for sure, because there's a lot of mixed emotions about what all happened with that deal. But anyways, well, Tom, it's a pleasure to speak to you as always. I know that you were active on Oil Pro. That's kind of on hiatus. Where can people find you at right now if they want to reach out and chat with you?
I don't know. Since Oil Pro is now down, there's word of trying to get a replacement site. I've tried using LinkedIn, but they keep censoring my content. So I've tried a couple other sites, but I haven't really found any place. So we'll just have to wait and see. You can always reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm available, easily found, but I'm not really commenting much these days just because I will point out LinkedIn keeps censoring my posts. I'm not happy about that. I'm used to being a moderator, and trust me, I'm not used to being censored.
Well, we won't censor your comments for this podcast, and so you're free to come on here and say what you want to say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good talking to you, Tom.
Okay, take care. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.